Hey guys, tonight we step right into the crunch of boots on dust-streaked paths that stretch far beyond what your eyes want to follow. You feel yourself among a crowd that's a mix of shimmering banners, sagging backpacks, and questionable footwear choices. The year is somewhere in the tail end of the 11th century, and everyone around you seems convinced they're headed east for God, honor, and maybe a chance to get out of paying taxes at home. You're surrounded by accents you don't recognize, languages tumbling over one another, and the smell of sweat so thick you'd think deodorant hadn't been invented yet, and spoiler alert, it really hadn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is, because I always love seeing the little constellation of listeners across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge eastward with this patchwork army. Some of the men near you have gleaming helmets, but more have dented tin bucket contraptions strapped to their heads, the kind that would lose in a fight with a modern cooking pot. Horses clop by, and you can tell some of them are already regretting the deal their owners made with destiny. Picture that one guy who insists on bringing a lute because he swears people will want music during sieges. You know, the medieval equivalent of someone lugging a full keyboard onto a camping trip. You feel the heat pressing down. The dust rises with every step, coating your tongue. Around you, stories spread like wildfire, rumors that in the east the air smells of cinnamon, that angels walk the walls of Jerusalem, that if you die on the road your soul takes an express lane past the pearly gates. And mixed in with the holy hype are plenty of earthy motivations. Some folks mutter that the Crusade is a real estate grab, an early attempt at colonial vacation homes with very bad plumbing. The mainstream historical fact that anchors you here is clear. Pope Urban II's call in 1095 actually did set tens of thousands in motion. They weren't just knights, they were farmers, tradesmen, even whole families. This wasn't a sleek professional army, it was a medieval road trip with questionable planning. You see people bringing along oxen, chickens, even goats, because who knows when you'll find a decent meal on the road. And the quirky tidbit? Well, some participants apparently believed they could scrape forgiveness for their sins by sewing little crosses onto their shirts. Imagine thinking a quick DIY sewing project was the ticket to eternal salvation. Though to be fair, modern fans still do that thing where they buy overpriced tour t-shirts to prove devotion. Human nature, right? As you walk, you hear heated debates around campfires. One man insists this is all about Holy Land, another swears it's about trade routes, while a third just wants a better climate because northern winters are overrated. Historians still argue whether the Crusaders were primarily religious fanatics, opportunistic settlers, or just people caught up in one of the biggest peer pressure movements in history. Night falls and you curl up on hard ground. The stars above are the same ones you'd see today, but they feel heavier, as though they know more about the future than the people. You wake up to the blare of trumpets that sound suspiciously like a child learning the recorder, sharp, uneven, and way too early. The air is cooler than yesterday, dew clinging to your cloak, and you notice your boots already stiff with dust. You shuffle into line, following the steady rhythm of thousands of feet pressing eastward. Ahead, people keep muttering about one thing: the holy city, Jerusalem. That glittering idea sits like a mirage in everyone's imagination. You can almost feel it shimmering on the horizon, even though in reality you're still hundreds of miles away and your sandals are already falling apart. The dream of Jerusalem isn't just religious, it's cinematic. You picture golden domes gleaming under the sun, streets paved with stones that whisper scripture, and angels practically handing out refreshment stands. The problem? That's not exactly what you'll get. The actual city is hot, overcrowded, and fiercely contested, but right now nobody in this crowd wants reality checks. You're being pulled by the idea of a perfect ending, the kind that would look good on stained glass windows and earn you bragging rights in heaven. As you plod along, the conversations swirl. Some crusaders talk about liberating the city for Christendom, others about proving themselves to their families, and a handful just want exotic souvenirs. A mainstream fact sets the stage here. Jerusalem at the time was under Muslim control, ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate after bouncing hands in the decades before. It wasn't simply us versus them like propaganda posters would have you believe, it was a complex political game, and the city was a prized piece on the chessboard. The quirky tidbit? Pilgrims before you sometimes brought home tiny bottles of Jerusalem dust as holy souvenirs. Yes, people literally carried around jars of dirt. Imagine explaining that to airport security today. Sir, why do you have 3 pounds of sand in your backpack? It's sacred, I promise. As the march stretches on, you realize how much this dream of Jerusalem is stitched together from sermons, rumors, and wishful thinking. You hear the man walking beside you whisper that if you so much as see the city walls, your sins will evaporate like morning mist. Someone else swears that once inside, you'll find relics stacked like a medieval flea market, pieces of the true cross, Mary's hairbrush, maybe even a splinter from Noah's Arkansas. The line between spiritual devotion and eBay-style shopping spree is very thin. And then, tucked between the excitement, come the doubts. The road is harder than expected, food is scarcer than promised, and you overhear arguments that maybe the Pope oversold the whole glorious victory thing. Historians still argue whether the Crusaders' obsession with Jerusalem was purely religious fervor or whether it masked a deeper hunger for land and influence. Was it about saving souls or securing new kingdoms? The debates echo like distant bells, and you're left walking in circles of uncertainty. By evening, the land shifts into rocky slopes. You catch the glint of a distant city, not Jerusalem yet, but a reminder that somewhere ahead the dream waits. The banners ripple as the sun sets, and the chant of Deus Vult rises again, booming and hollow at once. You don't know what you'll find when you finally reach that holy city, but the dream of it is already carrying you, step after step, as the night folds in. And as you close your eyes beneath the stars, you can almost see golden domes in your dreams, bright, perfect, and just out of reach. The sun climbs and the clatter of iron rises with it. You walk alongside a row of knights, their armor catching the light in gleams that make them look like walking lighthouses. But the closer you lean in, the more you notice the den. The morning greets you not with birdsong but with the creak of carts and the haggling tones of merchants who seem to materialize out of thin air. You blink sleep from your eyes and realize that while knights and peasants march east under banners of faith, a whole other crowd marches alongside, quieter, sharper, and armed not with swords but with scales, contracts, and secret ledgers. These are the merchants, the traders, the deal makers, and they're the ones who keep whispering about profit in places where others only see prayer. You smell it before you see it. Spices, dried fish, bolts of fabric stuffed into wagons. The Italians are everywhere. Men from Venice, Genoa, Pisa, eyes glittering like coins under the sun. You hear them offering loans to nobles, selling shoes to peasants, and whispering promises about fleets waiting at the ports. If the knights are the muscle of this story, then the merchants are the nervous system, quietly making sure blood keeps flowing, well, gold in this case. The mainstream fact to anchor you. Italian maritime republics gained enormous influence during the Crusades by providing ships, supplies, and trade connections. The Crusades weren't just wars, they were logistical nightmares, and without the merchants, armies might have collapsed into starvation. Venice, in particular, mastered the art of turning holy war into long-term profit. And the quirky tidbit? Venetian traders once shipped Crusaders east in exchange for future trade privileges, essentially renting out Uber rides for armed pilgrims. The problem? When Crusaders couldn't pay, the Venetians rerouted them to attack rival cities like Zara. Yes, the Crusaders literally ended up sacking a Christian city because their bill was overdue. Talk about the most violent debt collection in history. As you walk, you notice the divide. Pilgrims mutter prayers, knights polish swords, but merchants count coins, sketch contracts, and dream of ports they've never seen. For them, the holy city isn't Jerusalem, it's whichever marketplace offers the best margins. You overhear two Genoese sailors debating who will control grain shipments, while a Venetian clerk explains that God's will is most effective when paired with favorable tariffs. The question slips into your mind, echoing with the sound of wagons. Were the Crusades truly wars of faith, or were they cover stories for expanding trade networks? Historians still argue whether the Crusades were primarily spiritual missions hijacked by commerce, or commercial ventures disguised as holy quests. You sense both truths woven together, inseparable. Night finds you resting near a camp crowded with merchant tents. Instead of hymns, you hear the scratch of quills, the counting of coins, and the faint melody of someone humming while balancing ledgers. A merchant offers you a sip of spiced wine, sweeter than anything you've tasted so far. It burns a little, but in the quiet it feels like a reminder. Not everyone here marches east for the same reason. And as you close your eyes, you imagine ships bobbing in the Venetian lagoon, ready to carry armies and dreams, faith and greed, all bound toward the same distant horizon. The road east keeps winding, and somewhere along the churn of dust and clatter of hooves you realize this march isn't all testosterone and shining steel. Tonight, as campfires flicker against the night sky, you notice figures who are not knights, nor barefoot peasants, but women moving with quiet confidence between tents. Some tend to the wounded, some barter bread for gossip, and others command respect that makes even burly knights lower their eyes. You lean closer, and their stories unfold like hidden threads in the tapestry. There's a queen in shimmering fabric who travels with her retinue, her decisions shaping diplomacy as much as any sword swing. There's a widow who sells cloth, saving her profits to rebuild a life after her husband's death. And there's the woman with a child on her hip, trudging east because the crusade has become her family's only road forward. The idea that women stayed behind in castles? That's the children's book version. Reality is louder, messier, and much more complicated. The mainstream fact: noble women such as Eleanor of Aquitaine actually participated in crusades, wielding political influence and even rallying troops. Queens could shape alliances, arrange supplies, and sway kings. Meanwhile, less famous women served as nurses, laundresses, or camp followers who kept armies alive in ways no knightly ballad ever praised. The quirky tidbit? Chronicles mention women disguising themselves as men to fight. Some did it to protect husbands, others simply wanted their own slice of glory, or at least to avoid being treated as baggage. Picture someone carefully taping down their hair and hoping nobody noticed that their beard looked suspiciously like soot smudged on the face. You hear whispered debates under the tent canvas. Did women weaken discipline by distracting men, or did they strengthen armies by sustaining them? Historians still argue whether women's roles were anomalies or essential threads in the crusading machine. You know the truth lies somewhere between, stitched into every meal cooked, every wound washed, every command delivered from behind silken veils. By moonlight, you watch a noble woman overseeing provisions with the precision of a quartermaster. Her voice is firm, her eyes calculating. She knows that without her, supplies would vanish into chaos. You also notice camp followers singing lullabies, their melodies weaving a kind of peace amid clanging armor. It strikes you that courage isn't always the clashing of swords, it's the resilience of those who keep moving, even when history barely remembers their names. And as you drift toward sleep, you realize that the crusade is less a march of faceless men and more a caravan of lives intertwined, queens, widows, mothers, hidden fighters, all walking the same hard road east, each leaving footprints history rarely bothers to trace. The march continues, and you start noticing the people who never get painted into the grand oil canvases or marble reliefs. Not the kings, not the knights, not even the noble ladies, just the endless sea of ordinary folks who grind forward day after day. You feel their presence most at night, when the camp hums with low voices, laughter, and the shuffle of hands scraping bowls clean of barley stew. These are the forgotten foot soldiers. The men with cracked hands from farming, the boys barely old enough to hold a spear, the cooks stirring cauldrons of porridge that tastes like wet wood chips. They didn't come east chasing honor, they came because lords demanded it, or because the promise of adventure beat another winter of mud-soaked fields. And for many it wasn't a choice at all. When your lord goes, you go, even if you'd rather be back home patching fences. The mainstream fact that grounds you here: the majority of Crusader armies were not knights. They were common soldiers and camp followers. For every mounted noble, there were dozens of men on foot, hauling supplies, pushing carts, and trying to stay alive. They built the camps, dug trenches, and bore the brunt of starvation. And the quirky tidbit? Archaeologists have found evidence of improvised dice and game pieces among Crusader camps. Yes, even in the middle of a grueling march, people rolled bones for luck, betting scraps of food or a chance to dodge latrine duty. Picture a group of weary men, chainmail half unbuckled, cheering because someone just rolled the medieval equivalent of snake eyes. You listen to their stories as they share them under flickering firelight. One young man describes leaving his village because he heard Jerusalem was flowing with honey and fruit. Another admits he was dragged along by his older brother and still doesn't know exactly where East even is. A third, chewing stale bread, shrugs and mutters that this is just another Lord's War, and he hopes at least to come back with a new belt or pair of boots. But between their jokes and grumbles, you sense something steadier, the unrecorded courage it takes just to keep walking. They know that knights will get the credit, but without their calloused feet and tired shoulders, the crusade collapses. Historians still argue whether to count these men as faceless background or as the real engine of the movement. You realize, listening to their snores and coughs around you, that history is always quieter than the battles. It lives in the mud-caked boots, the aching backs, the forgotten dice clattering in the dark. As you pull your cloak tighter, you notice how ordinary voices fill the night like a choir. No bards, no banners, just humans sharing bread and bad jokes to survive another day on the endless road east. You close your eyes knowing that tomorrow, their march will carry history forward, even if their names never make it into the chronicles. The road twists into lands that feel less like Europe and more like a shifting frontier. You can smell the difference before you see it. Spices hanging in the air, sharper herbs cooked into food, and fabrics dyed in colors richer than anything back home. You're still walking with Crusaders, but you're starting to notice something curious. Even amid bloodshed and banners, cultures are trading secrets like kids swapping cards at recess. You pass a surgeon's tent and your eyes widen. Instead of the usual, just bite this stick and pray, you see Arab medical texts being translated in hushed voices. Crusaders may have come east swinging swords, but they're quickly realizing the locals know a thing or two about anatomy, herbs, and surgical tools. The mainstream fact here: Crusaders carried home medical knowledge, techniques for cleaning wounds, using opium derivatives for pain, and even cataract surgery methods. Suddenly the battlefield feels less medieval ER and more, well, slightly upgraded medieval ER. Then there's the quirky tidbit: sugar. Crusaders discovered refined sugar in the East and brought it back to Europe. Imagine an entire continent used to honey and suddenly finding out there's this crystalline magic dust that makes everything taste like a festival. By the time they return home, nobles can't get enough of it, and within a few centuries dentists are pulling their hair out. You also feel it in the architecture. Crusaders gape at pointed arches and domes rising in cities like Damascus and Aleppo, designs that will sneak back west and quietly revolutionize Europe's cathedrals. You walk past a monk sketching doorways like he's on a medieval Pinterest board. He doesn't admit it, but he's stealing style ideas. And then the debates reach your ears again. Some claim the Crusades spread knowledge, spurring Europe's rebirth. Others argue these exchanges happened despite, not because of, the wars. Historians still argue whether cultural transfer was a happy accident of violence or the actual hidden engine behind centuries of change. As you chew a date, sticky and sweet, you wonder if the argument even matters. The evidence is in your mouth. Night falls and traders from both sides still slip through the shadows, swapping fabrics for steel, news for salt, secrets for stories. You realize that even when armies clash, curiosity sneaks in, weaving bridges where swords would break them. You lie back under a star-strewn sky, belly warm from borrowed food, and smile at the thought that while banners shout division, the silent flow of ideas whispers unity. And as you drift, you can almost taste sugar on your tongue, sweet proof that even in war humans can't resist sharing what makes life richer. The air grows thicker as the march halts before towering walls. You feel the shift instantly. Gone is the restless rhythm of constant movement. Instead there's waiting, the kind that seeps into your bones. You've reached Antioch, a city whose walls look like they were built by giants who didn't believe in doors. The siege begins, and suddenly the crusade feels less like a march and more like a test of patience that could snap at any moment. The days blur into hunger. You watch crusaders pick weeds from the ground, boiling them into soups that taste like wet rope. Horses, once symbols of pride, are slaughtered for meat. You gag at the smell, but hunger has no dignity. The mainstream fact here: the siege of Antioch, 1097 to 1098, lasted nearly 8 months, with crusaders trapped between the city's defenses and Muslim relief forces outside. It became one of the most grueling episodes of the First Crusade. And the quirky tidbit? Chronicles mention crusaders eating leather, boiling belts, shoes, and saddle straps when food ran out. Imagine gnawing on your boots for dinner. It's survival mode at its bleakest, the medieval version of microwaving your wallet because the fridge is empty. Around campfires, the whispers grow darker. Some crusaders speak of betrayal, city gates nearly opened for bribes, spies sneaking out under cover of night. And then come the stranger murmurs, visions of saints and heavenly armies promising victory if only the faithful endure. Starvation and hallucination blur together until you can't tell which is prophecy and which is just your brain short-circuiting from lack of calories. You hear the arguments swirl. Was the eventual fall of Antioch proof of divine favor or the result of backroom deals with a traitorous guard? Historians still argue whether miracles or money opened the gates. What you know for sure is that when the city finally fell, it wasn't triumph so much as collapse. An exhausted, delirious surge forward by people who had already lost too much. Inside, the streets reek of death. But strangely, you also feel a surge of hope. For the first time, after months of chewing weeds and dreams, the crusade has a foothold. Fires light up the night, casting long shadows against the stone. People cheer, though their voices are hoarse, bodies gaunt. And as you curl into your cloak, belly gnawing itself, you understand why this siege became legend. It wasn't about glory or banners. It was about endurance, the kind of grim, stubborn refusal to give up even when you're chewing boiled leather. You fall asleep to the sound of hollow cheers echoing off Antioch's walls, a reminder that sometimes history is built not by heroes, but by the starving who simply keep standing. You leave Antioch behind, though honestly, it doesn't leave you. The memory of gnawing hunger, of belts boiled into soup, of leather softened until it was chewable, all of that stays clinging to your insides. But something else follows you too, something stranger: the stories. The voices of men who swear they saw saints descending from heaven, of women who whisper about relics shining in the dark, of children pointing to visions in the sky. You've probably noticed by now that the crusade isn't just fought with swords and shields. It's fought with imagination, with the need to believe that this brutal journey means something bigger than mud, hunger, and piles of bodies. Around campfires you hear the tales swell. Each retelling makes them brighter, sharper, more impossible, and more necessary. One knight grips your arm and leans close, his breath hot with garlic and desperation. He tells you that St. George himself rode beside them during the siege of Antioch. A great white horse, a shimmering lance, a warrior who never missed. You nod, though in your heart you wonder if the man was simply dizzy from hunger. But the knight's eyes shine, and for him the story is as real as the dust in his throat. Another soldier, younger, swears he saw angels perched on the walls, wings unfurled against the smoke. He describes the feathers in detail, shimmering as though sunlight had been trapped in down. And you think, if you were starving, filthy, and terrified, maybe you too would conjure light against the darkness. Here is your mainstream fact anchor. Crusader chronicles really do report these visions. Chroniclers like Raymond of Aguilers described the Holy Lance discovery and heavenly apparitions at Antioch as if they were unquestionable truth. These weren't fringe ramblings, they were written into history books, shaping how later generations remembered the Crusades. To medieval minds, saints and angels weren't metaphors, they were reinforcements. And then comes the quirky tidbit. The so-called discovery of the Holy Lance at Antioch. Picture this. The Crusaders are half dead, morale is collapsing, and then a monk named Peter Bartholomew claims he's had visions guiding him to the spear that pierced Christ's side. Digging commences. Men scrape through church floors, dirt under fingernails, hearts hammering. And, what do you know, they find a piece of iron. A convenient scrap of metal pulled from the ground, held aloft like Excalibur. Soldiers weep, priests sing, morale soars. Was it really the Holy Lance? Almost certainly not. But to the exhausted Crusaders, it was better than food. Hope itself became a weapon sharper than any sword. Of course, not everyone bought it. You overhear arguments by torchlight. Some mutter that Peter Bartholomew planted the relic, that the whole thing was staged. Later, when he tried to prove its authenticity by walking through fire, he suffered burns so severe he died days later. Not exactly the miracle ending you'd expect. And here lies the open debate. Historians still argue whether the visions and relics of the Crusade were genuine expressions of faith, mass hallucinations born of starvation, or outright fabrications meant to keep the army moving. Was the Holy Lance heaven's gift, or a desperate con trick? No one agrees. But what you see clearly is how powerful the stories became. Men who had barely been able to stand suddenly found strength. Soldiers who had whispered about desertion now lifted banners higher. Starvation was not defeated by bread, it was defeated by belief. And so the crusade marched on, carried by tales as much as by rations. As you walk, you notice how the myth grows faster than truth. Back home in Europe, news of miracles spreads like wildfire. Priests preach about heavenly armies marching beside crusaders. Peasants hear of relics found, saints appearing, crosses glowing in the sky. Each story recruits more men, gathers more donations, fuels more determination. The crusade isn't just fought in the East, it's fought in the imaginations of those waiting back home. You overhear one soldier say he's not afraid of dying, because if the saints are truly with them, then death is only a doorway. Another clutches a tiny wooden cross and mutters that he saw the Virgin Mary smiling on the battlefield. Are these hallucinations? Are they truths? Or are they simply the human brain trying to survive unendurable terror? You don't know. But you feel the weight of it pressing all around you. Let's not forget, miracle stories weren't unique to Christians. Muslim chroniclers too described visions, strange omens and dreams during night comes and you lie beneath a sky streaked with stars. Someone nearby is retelling the Holy Lance story for the 50th time, polishing it brighter with each sentence. You close your eyes and let the rhythm of his voice wash over you. Maybe you don't believe in relics dug from the dirt. Maybe you don't think angels really perched on those walls. But as sleep creeps closer, you understand why others believed. Because in this world of hunger and horror, belief is not a luxury. It's survival. And sometimes the sharpest sword a crusader carries isn't made of steel, it's made of stories. You drift off hearing prayers whispered into the night, each one a thread in the great tapestry of faith and doubt, myth and memory. Tomorrow the march continues, fueled by relics, by visions, by tales that may or may not be true, but that definitely keep the army alive. The road east keeps stretching, but something shifts in the air. You've grown used to the rhythm of armored boots, the grunts of oxen, the heavy smell of sweat and rust. But now you notice smaller footsteps, lighter voices, and a kind of brightness threading through the weary ranks. At first you think you're hallucinating from exhaustion again. After all, visions are practically a crusade specialty at this point, but no, your eyes don't deceive you. Children are marching. You blink. Children. Actual children. Not squires in training or teenage boys pretending to be men, but boys and girls, some no taller than your shoulder, trudging east with wide eyes and blistered feet. They carry wooden crosses, some bigger than their own bodies. A few drag sticks they call swords, splintered at the tips. And they are singing. Their voices are high, pure, and somehow more piercing than the clang of steel around them. It is unsettling yet mesmerizing, as if innocence itself has joined the army. You sidle closer to listen. A boy, maybe 10 years old, explains that Christ appeared to him in a dream and told him to go east, that his faith will open the seas and topple walls. He speaks with the unshakable confidence that only children have, the kind that doesn't bend under reason. You want to tell him about starvation, about betrayal, about what really waits at the edge of deserts and ports. But how do you break the illusion? You let him keep the dream, because even in this brutal world, faith that's strong feels sacred in its own way. The adults around them are conflicted. Some scoff, muttering that the children will slow everyone down, just extra mouths to feed when food is already a cruel joke. Others fall silent, staring at them with something like awe. You hear one knight whisper that if even children can march with such devotion, surely God must be with the crusade. Another mutters that perhaps the children's purity is the true weapon, stronger than any sword. The mood is infectious, even dangerous. Innocence has its own authority and you feel it rippling through the camp. The mainstream historical fact you anchor yourself to is this. In 1212, decades after the First Crusade, two movements emerged in France and Germany, often remembered collectively as the Children's Crusade. Thousands of young people, most of them teenagers but with children among them, believed they could reclaim the Holy Land through pure faith. Chroniclers tell of boys and girls convinced that the Mediterranean would part like the Red Sea, clearing a path to Jerusalem. It didn't. Instead, many perished on the journey, and some were sold into slavery after being lured onto ships by unscrupulous merchants. It is one of the most haunting episodes of crusading history, and one that blurs the line between legend and truth. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some accounts describe these children carrying banners decorated with lambs, doves, and other symbols of innocence. Imagine it, kids marching with painted flags showing fluffy sheep, convinced that their purity would melt hardened enemy warriors into laying down their swords. It's heartbreaking, yes, but also absurdly human, a collision of childlike creativity with a world too cruel to honor it. As you keep walking beside them, you hear the debate spill out. One older crusader snarls that these children are simply a burden, doomed to die, dragging down the army. Another insists they are chosen vessels, proof that God works through the meek to humble the mighty. The camp divides in whispers, faith and practicality tugging against each other. You realize that the debate never truly ends. Even now, historians still argue whether the Children's Crusade was a literal mass movement of thousands, or whether medieval chroniclers exaggerated small migrations of peasants and youth into one legendary tale. Were they really children, or simply the powerless, poor, landless, vulnerable, cast into a story that turned them into symbols of purity? The argument hums in the margins of every text, and you feel it in the silence of the road. By night, you sit near a fire watching the children settle. Some huddle together for warmth, whispering prayers, clutching their wooden crosses like lifelines. A girl pulls a small loaf of bread from her satchel and breaks it into crumbs to share. The act feels almost sacramental, and for a moment you forget you are in a war at all. Then you hear coughing, see the gaunt faces, and remember reality. Devotion doesn't fill bellies. Stories fly fast as they always do. One rumor says the children singing brought rain to a parched camp. Another insists they will part the seas when they reach the Mediterranean. You can't help but picture the scene. Thousands of small voices raised in hymn, staring at the waves, waiting for water to split like curtains on a stage. And when it doesn't, you shiver at the thought. Yet, despite the dread, you can't deny the power they carry, not physical power but symbolic. Their presence shifts morale. Hardened soldiers who had begun to doubt the crusade now whisper that God must be with them if even children join the cause. The children become living proof, at least in the minds of many, that heaven smiles on this journey. And in a world already fueled by relics, visions, and miracle tales, that is enough to keep thousands moving forward. Weeks pass and the children keep walking. Some drop away, collapsing under heat or hunger. Some are taken in by townspeople, vanishing from the march. Others cling to the path, eyes fixed on the horizon. You can't help but admire their stubbornness, even as your heart breaks. The road doesn't soften just because the feet walking it are smaller. And then the stories darken. Whispers say that when the children finally reached the sea, merchants offered them ships. Free passage they promised. But instead of carrying them to Jerusalem, those ships carried them to slave markets in North Africa. Betrayal is the oldest theme in crusading history, and here it cuts deepest of all. Whether the tale is true in every detail or embroidered over centuries, you can feel the horror of it settling like ash. Innocence devoured by greed. Hope drowned in waves that never parted. You lie awake that night, staring at the stars, listening to the faint songs of the children echo through the camp. Their voices are fragile, almost ghostly, but they carry. And as you drift toward sleep, you realize that whether they were literal or legendary, the Children's Crusade remains unforgettable because it speaks to something. It is the part of history that makes you ache because it feels too raw, too close to truths that still haunt the world today. The fire dies and you close your eyes. You see them walking still, barefoot, banners painted with lambs, eyes full of impossible hope. They march toward a horizon they will never reach, and yet somehow their story will echo through centuries, a reminder that even the smallest voices can shake the world, if only for a moment. Of knights who vowed to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. The Hospitallers, originally a charitable group dedicated to running a hospital in Jerusalem, transformed into a military brotherhood to defend those same travelers. Over time, these orders grew into powerful transnational institutions, answerable only to the Pope. They held castles across the Levant, commanded fleets of ships, and became some of the wealthiest and most influential organizations of the Middle Ages. What started as small groups of warrior monks soon rivaled kings. But don't picture them only as pious monks with swords. The quirky tidbit here will make you smile. The Templars had such strict rules of conduct that they banned even innocent gestures. A knight was forbidden from kissing his mother or sister on the cheek, in case it stirred impure thoughts. Yes, you could gallop into battle, hack through enemies, and shout about salvation at the top of your lungs, but heaven forbid you hugged your mom after Massachusetts. Their rulebook read like a medieval HR manual on overdrive. No gambling, no swearing, no flashy clothes, and definitely no snuggling. Yet what fascinates you most is how differently everyone else in the crusade views them. By the fireside, peasants whisper in awe, calling the Templars the army of God. They say these men cannot be defeated, that their discipline makes them invincible. But in darker corners, you overhear others muttering suspicions. They speak of secret rituals performed in locked chapels, of treasures hoarded away, of strange oaths whispered at night. Even in their own time, rumors trailed the orders like shadows. Were they holy warriors or secret schemers? And here lies the open scholarly debate that lingers even now. Historians still argue whether the Templars and Hospitallers were primarily pious defenders of Christendom, financial innovators who essentially invented international banking, or political power brokers weaving influence behind the scenes. Some modern scholars even suggest that the aura of secrecy was exaggerated, blown out of proportion by later enemies who needed an excuse to destroy them. Others argue that their vast wealth and independence from kings made them, in effect, a medieval state within a state. You can feel the tension in the air. These knights are admired, feared, and resented all at once. Walking among them, you notice how they balance their dual identities. On one hand they are monks. They pray at dawn and dusk, chant psalms in Latin, and treat their communal meals as acts of devotion. On the other hand they are soldiers carrying swords polished with care, trained to fight in disciplined formations. Most crusaders are driven by personal glory or survival. These men fight because their vows demand it, because they believe God himself wrote their orders. And vows, you realize, can be far more dangerous than hunger or ambition. You trail behind them into a fortified camp one evening. The difference hits you instantly. While other camps sprawl messily, tents pitched at random, livestock wandering between fires, the Templars' camp is organized in clean rows. Their gear is stored neatly. Their prayers ripple across the space in unified cadence. It feels less like a military camp and more like a monastery armed with swords. But order has a price. You hear grumbles from outsiders who envy their supplies, their training, their strange ability to remain calm in chaos. Some accuse the Hospitallers of hoarding medicine, tending only to their own. Others say the Templars manipulate trade routes to grow richer. And you realize another truth: power attracts suspicion as surely as a torch attracts moths. Later that night, lying under the stars, you hear their prayers carried on the wind. The Latin phrases rise and fall like waves, steady and rhythmic. It isn't exactly soothing, it's too stern for that, but it is grounding. Their discipline has a gravity that pulls you in. You wonder how many of these men truly believe they are serving God, and how many are simply trapped in a system too vast to escape. Either way, they march forward, step after step, like living symbols of faith sharpened into weapons. You close your eyes and imagine the centuries ahead. Conspiracies about hidden treasures, legends of lost relics, stories that will turn these orders into myth long after their castles crumble. Tonight, though, they are just men in plain mantles, whispering prayers while the rest of the camp snores. You let the steady hum of their voices carry you towards sleep, realizing that in the crusade, silence can be as intimidating as the clash of swords. You've grown used to hearing stories told by the Crusaders themselves, knights boasting, priests chanting, peasants muttering in the dark. But tonight, you sense another presence, like eyes watching from beyond the firelight. The Crusaders think they are the center of the world, striding east in God's name, banners high. Yet just across the horizon, in cities and fortresses, there are others, scribes dipping pens in ink, carefully recording this strange invasion. And their voices sound very different. You sit by the fire, but in your imagination you drift outward, slipping beyond the Crusader camp. Across deserts and cities, in Damascus, Cairo, Aleppo, Baghdad, pens scratch across parchment. Muslim chroniclers are writing, their ink sharp as blades. They describe the same events you've lived through, but with eyes trained differently. To them, these Crusaders are not holy warriors. They are Franks, clumsy, brutal, and baffling creatures who stumbled east like noisy, armored locusts. The first thing you notice is how often Muslim writers mock the Crusaders' lack of hygiene. Chroniclers describe them as smelling foul, their clothes stiff with dirt, their habits barbaric. And honestly, you can't argue. After weeks of trudging through dust and sweat, you've smelled the camp. It's like a combination of wet goat and burnt onions. No wonder locals thought of the Franks as strange, unwashed beasts. The mainstream fact grounding you here. Muslim chroniclers like Ibn al-Qalanisi in Damascus and Usama ibn Munkid, a Syrian nobleman and writer, recorded detailed accounts of the Crusades from the Muslim perspective. Their works are invaluable today because they show us how the invaders were perceived, not as noble knights but as awkward, reckless, sometimes terrifying, sometimes laughable. And then there's the quirky tidbit. Usama ibn Munkid, in his memoirs, tells the story of a Frankish doctor who attempted to treat a patient with abscesses. Instead of lancing and cleaning the wound, the doctor simply hacked off part of the patient's body with an axe. Another time, a Frankish doctor tried to cure a man with diarrhea by cutting open his stomach. Both patients died immediately, of course, and Usama couldn't resist shaking his head at the barbarity. It's like a medieval Yelp review, Frankish medicine. 1 star would not recommend. Yet for all the mockery you also feel the chroniclers' unease. Because as bumbling as the Crusaders seemed, they were also dangerously zealous. Muslim writers describe how the Franks fought with reckless abandon, charging into hopeless battles, refusing to surrender even when cornered. That kind of irrational fury was frightening because it made them unpredictable. You can smell the mix of disdain and fear in the ink. You imagine sitting with Usama himself. He tells you about encounters with the Franks, sometimes fighting them, sometimes hunting with them, even sharing meals. He admits that individual Crusaders could be generous, honorable, even friendly. He once described a Frankish knight who gave up his horse so Usama could ride, an act of courtesy he praised. And yet, in the next breath, he calls their culture coarse, their manners shocking, their faith impossible. It's a fascinating paradox. Disdain for the group, respect for certain individuals. And here lies the scholarly debate that hums through centuries. Historians still argue whether Muslim chroniclers viewed the Crusades mainly as an existential religious war, jihad against invaders, or as just another wave of foreign raiders in a long history of border conflicts. Were the Crusaders seen as apocalyptic enemies, or merely as irritating barbarians destined to pass like others before them? Some evidence suggests the latter. Many Muslim rulers initially treated the Crusaders as pawns in their own local power struggles, allies of convenience one year, enemies the next. The idea of the Crusades as a titanic clash of civilizations may be more a product of later centuries than of the time itself. You drift further into these perspectives. Imagine the streets of Damascus when the first news arrived. Thousands of armored men from the west marching eastward. To locals they were less holy warriors and more like natural disasters, strange, destructive, and unpredictable. One chronicler described them as people who knew nothing of the world, baffled by Arabic customs, misunderstanding markets, barging into mosques thinking they were churches. You chuckle softly because you've seen how easily Crusaders get lost even in their own camps. At the same time, the chroniclers marveled at the Crusaders' stubbornness. A city would fall, the Franks half-starved, yet instead of dispersing they would hunker down and hold. Muslim writers alternated between contempt for their foolishness and dread of their persistence. Imagine being mocked as filthy fools one moment, and feared as fanatics the next. That contradiction is the heart of how Eastern eyes saw the crusade. You picture the scribes by lamplight. One dips his pen recording the battle at Antioch. He describes the Franks howling like wolves, throwing themselves at walls, eating leather and grass to survive. He calls them desperate, monstrous, almost inhuman. Yet he also notes their determination, a quality that makes them maddeningly difficult to defeat. Another scribe describes the siege of Jerusalem, writing of the rivers of blood when the city fell in 1099. His tone shifts from mockery to horror, the pen scratching harder against the parchment, as if the memory itself burns. And as you read these words in your mind, you feel something unsettling. The Crusades are not one story, they are two told in parallel, sometimes intersecting, often colliding. To the Crusaders, this is a holy quest, full of relics, visions, and divine promises. To the Muslim chroniclers, this is an invasion of coarse barbarians, terrifying in their violence, baffling in their customs, and occasionally, reluctantly, respectable in their stubborn faith. The night deepens, and you lie under the stars, listening not to Latin chants this time but to the imagined scratch of Arabic pens. You hear disdain in the strokes, but also fear, curiosity, even moments of reluctant admiration. You drift in that space between stories, realizing that history is never one voice but a chorus. Sometimes harmonious, sometimes discordant, always richer when you lean in to hear both sides. You close your eyes, and as you do, you imagine the chroniclers watching still. Their words outlast the banners, the swords, the castles. Long after the dust has settled, it is their ink that remains. And in their eyes you see yourself not as hero or villain, but as a strange figure stumbling across the page, clumsy, zealous, human. You're still walking, but by now the road feels less like a path across earth and more like a debate stretched out under the stars. Every conversation you overhear in camp turns into an argument. Priests argue with knights, knights argue with merchants, and sometimes peasants argue with themselves. And it's not just the Crusaders. In towns you pass, in letters carried west, in sermons shouted from pulpits, the question hums louder than marching drums. What exactly is this thing we're all doing? It's tempting to believe the crusade has always been one clear story, holy warriors marching east to reclaim sacred land. But you know by now that reality is never that tidy. You've tasted the dust, smelled the leather soup, seen the merchants trading coins in shadows, and watched children drag crosses down impossible roads. The crusade is not one tale. It's dozens, hundreds, told differently depending on who's speaking. And the arguments, then and now, show no sign of ending. The mainstream fact that anchors you here. Historians have never agreed on what the Crusades really were. Were they wars of faith, primarily religious quests driven by devotion? Or were they thinly disguised land grabs, a chance for younger sons and restless nobles to carve out estates abroad? Or were they something else entirely, the messy birth of a global system, where East and West collided and exchanged goods, ideas, and grudges? You listen to the soldiers arguing around the fire. One insists he's here for salvation, that every step he takes scrubs the sin off his soul. Another admits he mostly came because there was nothing left for him back home. No land, no inheritance, no prospects. A third just shrugs and says, "The Pope said go, so here I am." 3 men, 3 explanations, 3 truths that don't quite match, and yet all 3 are marching east together. Then comes the quirky tidbit. Some crusaders apparently carried letters of indulgence, like medieval coupons for salvation, handed out by clergy to certify their sins were forgiven for joining the cause. Imagine a soldier pulling out a slip of parchment the way you might flash a gym membership card, declaring, "See? I'm covered." It feels absurd, but in their minds it was as powerful as armor. As you lie on the ground, staring at the fire, you realize these debates didn't stop when the march ended. They've rolled forward for centuries, echoing louder in modern classrooms than in ancient tents. Historians still argue whether to see the Crusades primarily as episodes of religious fanaticism, as proto-colonial ventures, or as early globalization gone horribly wrong. Each lens shifts the meaning like tilting stained glass under different light. Some say the Crusades were Europe's attempt to export violence, channeling its restless knights outward instead of letting them tear apart their own kingdoms. Others argue it was never that organized, more like a chaotic crowd surge than a carefully orchestrated plan. You think back to the merchants you passed in Venetian cloaks, the women tending campfires, the peasants gnawing stale bread, the monks in armor praying with swords at their sides. Which of them defines the crusade? Is it even fair to lump them together under one label? The arguments aren't only academic. Even today the word crusade sparks heated emotions. Politicians use it as shorthand for righteous struggle, while others condemn it as a symbol of aggression. The echoes of this medieval march ripple far beyond the dust and banners. You feel it in your bones. This isn't just history, it's memory contested, weaponized, reinterpreted again and again. You roll over trying to sleep, but the voices won't quiet. Was this journey about God, about greed, or about something else entirely? Maybe it was all three tangled together. Maybe no one marching truly knew, and maybe that's why the debates never end. You sigh, realizing you're not going to solve the question tonight. But as your eyes close, the fire crackles, carrying the sound of arguments into the dark, and you know one thing for sure. History's sharpest battles are often fought not with swords but with words. You wake before dawn, shivering beneath your cloak, and for once the camp is unusually quiet. No dice clattering, no merchants haggling, no peasants swearing at broken carts. Instead you hear murmurs, low, reverent, almost fevered. People are gathered around a wooden chest, eyes wide, as if it contained a beating heart. And in a way it does. Someone whispers that inside lies a splinter of the true cross, the very wood on which Christ was crucified. You edge closer and realize that relics, more than swords or shields, often carry the weight of this crusade. The army marches not just on rations but on stories, on objects that claim to bridge earth and heaven. They are displayed, kissed, paraded, and fought over. And when men are half dead from hunger, relics become more nourishing than bread. The mainstream fact here is simple but staggering. Relics were central to crusading culture. Leaders carried pieces of the true cross into battle, convinced they guaranteed victory. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, the Crusaders marched behind such a relic, believing it would secure God's favor, only to be crushed by Saladin's forces, losing both battle and relic in one devastating blow. The fate of that fragment became a legend in itself, its absence haunting Crusader memory for generations. And then there's your quirky tidbit. The market for relics was booming and authenticity was, let's say, flexible. Merchants sold splinters of wood as fragments of the true cross so often that one medieval wit joked there were enough pieces floating around to build an entire ship. Others offered vials of Mary's milk, or feathers from the angel Gabriel's wing. You can picture pilgrims clutching these like medieval Pokemon cards, trading salvation one relic at a time. As you walk, you see how deeply relics shape morale. A banner blessed by a saint makes men charge harder. A shard of bone from a martyr convinces starving soldiers that heaven is already marching beside them. And when relics go missing, stolen, lost, or captured, the despair is heavy as though God himself has turned away. You overhear endless arguments. One knight insists a relic guarantees victory, another counters that faith alone matters, not objects. A merchant mutters that most relics are frauds, while a priest shushes him, warning against blasphemy. And so you stumble into the scholarly debate that still echoes. Were relics genuinely believed to hold divine power, or were they psychological props, tangible anchors for desperate armies? Historians still argue whether relics were miracles in wood and bone or simply morale boosters dressed in gold and silk. Night comes and you find yourself lying beside a chest that supposedly holds a saint's finger bone. The soldiers nearby whisper prayers as if the bone can hear. You close your eyes, wondering whether faith flows through relics like electricity through wire, or whether it's only humans always needing something to touch who give them power. And as you drift, you realize relics are not just objects, they are stories you can hold. Splinters of wood, scraps of cloth, bones polished smooth with kisses. They are pieces of a past too sacred to question. The march bends westward, away from the holy city, away from the dream of golden domes, and you suddenly find yourself thinking not of deserts and sieges but of Europe, of home. What does it mean to return from a crusade? The road back is long, often lonelier than the road out, and the men who stumble into their villages are not the same people who left. They carry scars, debts, and stories heavier than any chainmail. You walk alongside a group of survivors heading back toward the ports. Their clothes are in tatters, their armor sold off or lost. One man clutches a bundle wrapped in silk, precious spices, the kind worth more than silver. Another leads a limping mule laden with strange fabrics. Yet another stares blankly into the distance, his only souvenir the memory of friends buried under foreign soil. The mainstream fact is clear. The Crusades transformed Europe by bringing back not just relics and stories, but trade goods, cultural practices, and debts. Nobles returned with silk, sugar, and exotic spices that reshaped European tastes. Italian cities grew rich as middlemen in this new economy. But for every knight who strutted home with treasures, Others dragged themselves back penniless, estates mortgaged to pay for the journey. Some never returned at all, their families left to guess whether they were dead or enslaved. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some crusaders brought back animals as exotic souvenirs. Chronicles mention peacocks strutting in noble gardens, camels paraded through towns, even monkeys gifted as curiosities. Imagine medieval villagers gasping as a crusader returned with a squawking parrot perched on his shoulder. Half proof of adventure, half medieval party trick. You hear their stories as the ships creak in port. A weary knight boasts that he walked the streets of Jerusalem, though you notice he conveniently skips the details about how many people starved along the way. Another man sighs, admitting he never saw the holy city at all, only endless desert and broken promises. The truth is messy, but the tales are polished for eager ears back home. And this is where the scholarly debate kicks in. Historians still argue whether the greatest legacy of the Crusades lies in what they took, land, lives, relics, or in what they brought back. Did the Crusades enrich Europe, planting seeds of the Renaissance with new knowledge and trade links? Or did they bleed Europe dry, draining resources into endless wars that left more ruin than renewal? The balance tilts differently depending on which ledger you study. You picture the villages receiving their returning sons. A father embraces a gaunt boy who left as a farmer and returned as a scarred man. A wife weeps, holding her husband who limps forever after a spear wound. Some homes never open their doors again because no one comes back to knock. The Crusades' aftermath is not just silk and sugar, it's empty chairs at supper tables. And yet, for those who do return, the world feels larger now. They've tasted dates sweeter than honey, seen cities that stretch beyond the horizon, heard prayers in languages they couldn't understand but somehow respected. Home feels smaller but also richer, changed by what they carry in memory and in hand. As night falls on the port, you curl under your cloak, listening to the creak of ships and the quiet murmur of men dreaming of home. You realize the crusade doesn't end on the battlefield. It ends here, in the difficult return, in the burden of carrying East back west. And the question that lingers is whether Europe is better for it, or simply heavier with debts and ghosts. The ships have carried men back to Europe, but the echoes of the Crusades are not just measured in scars and debts. They seep into music, into painted walls, into the words of poets who never saw Jerusalem but feel as if they did. Tonight, as you walk through a camp still alive with embers, you hear a sound rising over the clatter of armor and the snores of weary men. A song. It is not a hymn this time, nor a chant in Latin. It is a ballad sung by a minstrel, a wandering voice threading stories into melody. His words lift the crusade out of dust and blood and set it shimmering in rhyme. To the soldiers listening, it's a reminder that they are not just hungry men on a road. They are characters in a story already spreading across Europe, carried by song. The mainstream fact here: the Crusades left an enormous footprint in European art and literature. Troubadours in France composed songs praising noble knights who went east. Chronicles written in monasteries turned messy campaigns into grand narratives of divine will. Stained glass windows and church frescoes filled with imagery of knights, crosses, and holy battles. Even those who never left their villages encountered the Crusades every time they looked at a church wall or heard a wandering minstrel strum his lute. And here's your quirky tidbit: some Crusader songs weren't lofty hymns but sharp satire. One surviving piece, sung in Occitan, pokes fun at Crusaders who bragged of holy devotion but really cared more about loot and women. Imagine a medieval version of a parody song, mocking hypocrisy with clever rhymes. It's proof that even in the 12th century, audiences loved a roast. You picture villagers gathered in a square, eyes wide as a troubadour sings of Jerusalem glowing in the sunset, of saints appearing on the battlefield, of knights so brave their swords burned like fire. The reality, was dirtier, hungrier, more confusing. But art smooths rough edges, shaping memory into legend. Children grow up humming refrains that make the Crusades sound like epic fairy tales. And yet, not all songs are praise. Some are laments, mourning those who never returned. A widow commissions a song about her husband, painting him as a martyr even if he died of fever before a battle. A father requests a ballad for his son, turning loss into music that can be sung at feasts. Through melody, grief becomes part of public memory, shared and softened. Here lies the scholarly debate that still hums among historians. Did art and literature glorify the Crusades, making them seem holier and nobler than they were? Or did they, in some cases, critique them, slipping in satire and sorrow that undercut official narratives? Some scholars argue the troubadours mostly served propaganda, and in those echoes the crusade becomes less about what really happened, and more about what people choose to remember. You wake to the sound of an argument that doesn't belong to a single campfire, it stretches across centuries. The Crusades may have ended on battlefields long ago, but their legacy lingers, not in relic chests or ruined castles, but in the spaces between communities, in the quiet suspicion that can simmer for generations. Tonight you feel that weight most heavily. The march is quieter now, fewer banners snapping in the wind, but in the silence you can almost hear the future groaning under what's been sown. The mainstream fact anchoring you here. The Crusades left behind a legacy of mistrust and division between Latin Christians and Muslims, and also between Western Latin Christians and Eastern Greek Orthodox Christians. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 by Crusaders, meant to be allies, burned bridges that had stood for centuries. The wounds ran deep, poisoning relations long after swords were sheathed. For Muslims, the memory of Frankish invasions became part of a long narrative of outsiders battering at their lands. For Orthodox Christians, betrayal by fellow Christians became a scar never fully healed. And then the quirky tidbit, medieval graffiti carved into mosque walls and church stones by both sides. Archaeologists have found crude sketches, crosses scrawled inside Islamic cities, crescents etched by Muslim captives inside European fortresses. It's as if anonymous hands wanted to shout across time, "We were here. We fought. We endured." These little doodles are smaller than epic battles but somehow more human, like the footnotes of division scribbled in stone. Around you, people whisper different versions of what comes next. Some claim the Crusades forged respect between warriors who came to admire one another's courage, like Saladin sparing King Richard's men, or chivalric tales spun to soften hatred. Others insist the wars carved hatred so deep it seeped into holy texts, sermons, and stories passed from father to son. Historians still argue whether the Crusades should be seen primarily as a clash of civilizations birthing long-term hostility, or as a temporary spasm of violence that only later generations inflated into a grand divide. Were they truly the origin of enduring enmity, or have modern interpreters stretched them into symbols larger than they were at the time? You think back to the Muslim chroniclers you listened to in Damascus and Aleppo. For some, the Franks were nothing more than another group of raiders, frustrating but hardly apocalyptic. For others, they were monsters whose memory bled into sermons centuries later. You think of the Orthodox priests in Constantinople, forced to watch Crusaders loot their holy relics, their golden icons melted down to pay Venetian debts. Imagine being told your fellow Christians were coming to protect you, only to have them storm your city instead. That betrayal echoes more loudly than any victory. The campfire crackles, and a knight beside you mutters about honor, about how his people will be remembered as defenders of Christendom. But you know memory doesn't work like that. To those in the East, his name will not sound like honor. It will sound like ruin. Memory twists depending on who tells it. You picture a young child in Cairo, listening to his grandfather's story about the Franks who came like wolves. You picture a boy in Paris, hearing a minstrel sing about noble knights marching east. Same crusade. Two worlds. Two legacies that will never fit together neatly. And you realize something unsettling: division itself becomes a relic. Not stored in a chest, not kissed at mass, but carried quietly in attitudes, in suspicion, in the way one group describes another. Invisible but heavy. The night deepens and you lie back under the stars, feeling the strange duality of it all. The Crusades planted both weeds of mistrust and seeds of respect, both poison and fleeting admiration. Which legacy grows depends on who waters it. And the debate still rages, long after the banners have faded, in classrooms, in sermons, in conversations about modern wars. You close your eyes, hearing the whispers of division stretching across time. They are quieter than swords but they last longer. And as you drift, you sense that the Crusades will never truly end, not because of relics or castles, but because of the echoes of mistrust they left behind. The road narrows now, not because the path itself has changed, but because you can feel the story drawing toward its end. The banners are fewer, the chants quieter, and the army that once felt endless has dwindled to scattered ships rocking at harbor. You stand on the shore and watch the last Crusaders load their belongings, rusted helmets, tattered cloaks, boxes that may or may not contain relics, and climb aboard vessels that creak under the weight of history. The great march east that began with trumpets and sermons now fades with the splash of oars and salt water. You realize that you've walked through not just one crusade but the shadow of many. The First Crusade's shocking victories, the long sieges, the merchants' deals, the relics paraded through camps, the children with their impossible hopes, the knights in cloaks, the women tending fires, the chroniclers on both sides, each thread now tangles together. And as the last ship drifts from the horizon, You feel how these threads keep tugging long after the banners are lowered. The mainstream fact that anchors you here. By the late 13th century, the Crusader states in the Holy Land collapsed. Acre, the last major stronghold, fell in 1291 to Mamluk forces. The age of Crusades in the Levant was over, though smaller crusading efforts sputtered on in Iberia and the Baltic. The dream of a permanent Christian Jerusalem dissolved into sea mist, but the memory refused to sink. And your quirky tidbit. Crusaders sometimes carried back sand from the beaches of Acre or Jerusalem in little pouches, treating it like portable holy ground. Imagine a man kneeling in a French village church, sprinkling a pinch of Levantine sand into the soil as if he were planting the East in his backyard. Holy souvenirs pocket-sized. As you watch those ships disappear, you hear the arguments still swirling. Were these wars failures, wastes of lives and treasure? Or were they stepping stones that connected distant worlds, however violently? Historians still argue whether to call the Crusades a disaster of fanaticism or the messy beginning of global interaction. The truth is complicated, and perhaps that's the only answer history ever gives. The sea darkens, stars blinking into place overhead. You feel a strange quiet settle, the kind that comes not after victory or defeat but after exhaustion. The Crusades are finished, but their echoes stretch far. In art, in politics, in mistrust, in stories told by both victors and victims. You pull your cloak tighter and breathe in the salt air, realizing you've walked through a history that still shapes the present, even if most people don't realize it. The ships are gone now, their sails swallowed by the horizon, leaving only the hush of waves against the shore. You lie down on the sand, letting the cool grains shift beneath you, each one a fragment of the past you've just walked through. The night is soft, the stars scattered wide, and your body finally breathes slowly in and out, letting the sounds of the water soften every thought. The clamor of battles, the cries of hungry camps, the sharp scratch of chroniclers' pens, all of it drifts farther away, like voices fading in another room. What remains is the steady rhythm of the sea, a sound that has outlasted knights, kings, and banners. As you sink deeper into the sand, you notice how the breeze carries the faint scent of salt, clean and cool, brushing your face like a gentle hand. The waves move in long, even sighs, each one slower than the last, as if the sea itself is falling asleep with you. You remember relics kissed in torchlight, songs sung by minstrels, children marching barefoot with painted banners. They come back not as harsh memories but as soft shapes now, blurring at the edges, like lanterns dimming in mist. Everything sharp turns smooth. Everything heavy becomes lighter. The stars above seem to lean closer, their glow steady and calm, guiding you away from restless thoughts. Your breath deepens. Your body unwinds. The story is over, but its echoes hum gently, a lullaby carried on the tide. Let the horizon fade. Let the banners drop. Let the silence wrap around you like a cloak. The march is done. The night is yours,